please. We continue in last week's teaching. Yochanan, chapter 19, verse 41. We want to personally thank the Discovery Channel for giving us this teaching entitled No Bones About It. I want to send my personal thanks to the Discovery Channel for putting out a bunch of lies that we turned around and used to preach the truth. Hello. Yochanan 19:21. We have so much to cover from last week. If you weren't here last week, don't get the DVD. Break down someone's door that has the DVD. That's where we were last week. Am I telling you the truth? Hello?
Amen.
Am I telling you the truth? Break down the door and find someone that can get a hold of that DVD or that audio tape. So I'll be preaching part 2 this week for a little while. Not too much of a while, but a little while. Yochanan 19:41, part 2 of the message we began last week, No Bones About It. What truth was there in the Discovery Channel? Nothing. There were no bones in that silly tune, because we learned last week that the true place Yeshua's bones are is the true place Yeshua was crucified. And the true place Yeshua was crucified is the true place where you'll find his bones. Because it says in Yochanan 19:41, it says this. Now in the place where Yeshua was impaled, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb where no man was ever laid. There they laid Yeshua because of the Yehudim's preparation day for Passover. For the tomb was nearby. Where was the tomb? Nearby. So once we determine where he was crucified, that's when we can determine where he was buried. He was buried and crucified right next to each other, because when you find the crucifixion site, you also find the tomb, and it was in the garden. We learned last week that it was in the complex, the 2,000 square foot circular complex known as what? Inside the camp. So within the Temple Mount, the Garden of Eden, we learned that last week. Sorry, that's why you have to be here every week. I'm not going to go over that. My apologies. From the Garden of Eden, we go out into the land of Eden, across the Kidron Valley, and onto the Mount of Olives. Lloyd, since you're in the first row, would you hand these out, please? Make sure everybody gets one of these. I see you got your hands full. And Bert, you make sure they get one of these. So every person, every adult gets 2. Every adult gets 2. This will really help you in today's message. This will really help you. So we learned last week that we see in Yochanan 19:41, it says the place where he was impaled, there was a garden. What garden? The Garden of Gethsemane, which is at the foot of the Mount of Olives, but in the greater context, we learned last week that that was in fact the Garden of Eden. We learned that proof positive last week. We're going to learn that more this week. So where he was impaled, we're going to find his real bones. There were no bones about that fake tomb, but we're going to find out where his real bones are, where we discover where he was really crucified, Yeshua, during the 14th of Aviv. And once we discover where he was crucified, we are going to discover where that new tomb was in the Garden of Eden, which is the same place as the Garden of Gethsemane. It's all the same place. Talk to me, somebody. Baruch Hashem Yahweh. We closed last week's teaching with some quick insights about the tree of life. We found out last week that there was a remnant of the tree of life. And we found out that the last place we chased that remnant of the tree of life was a branch that budded almonds. You remember how we closed last week? How many remember how we closed last week's teaching? That branch that budded into almonds. We traced it through Moshe. We traced it through Aaron's rod that budded, because Aaron's rod that budded was a branch, a remnant branch from the tree of life. And so we traced all that, and now we're going to trace that same almond branch some more. And we know that that was the rod of Moshe, which became Aaron's rod that budded in Bamidbar 17. And all the rebels were, their buds did not bud, and the bud of Aharon died. now look at Shemot, don't turn there because I'm going to go quickly. Shemot 16:33. Moshe said to Aaron, take one pot, and put there the fullness of the omer of manna, a pot of manna, and let it rest before Yahweh as a charge for your what? For your generations. Very good. I'm glad everybody's alive today. As Yahweh has given commandment to Moshe, so does Aharon. Let it rest before the testimony. Now, if we go to Hebrews, Ivrim 9:3, and I'm not going to turn there for the sake of time. Behind the second veil is a sanctuary called the Kadosh HaKadoshim. That's the Holy of Holies. And in it, the Ark of the Covenant, covered on all sides with gold and a mercy seat. Also in the Holy of Holies is the golden bowl of manna, and the rod of Aaron that what? Budded. So the rod of Aaron that was from the tree of life, from the Garden of Eden, which we know was the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, that branch became the rod of Moshe. That branch became dated back to Adam, and it was passed down through generations of Israel until it wound up as Aaron's rod that budded. Where was it kept? In the Holy of Holies, in the wilderness tabernacle, the Ohel Moed, as well as in the first temple, inside the Holy of Holies. Baruch Hashem Yahweh. Now, please don't look at your handouts now. Turn them upside down. That's cheating. Turn them upside down and pay attention. And I'll tell you when we can take out the handouts. Bamidbar 21:6. We go to another account. When the people of Yahweh, in Bamidbar 21:6, the people of Yahweh rebelled against Moshe and against his leadership, and Yahweh sent fiery serpents into the camp to bite them and to destroy them because of their backbiting and their what? Complaining. So Yahweh sent these fiery serpents into the camp. Now we're told in Bamidbar 21:6-8 that the serpents bit the people, so that many of Israel died. And the people came to Moshe saying, we've sinned against Yahweh and against you. Pray to Yahweh that he takes away the serpents from us. And Yahweh said to Moshe, make a fiery serpent, set it on a pole. It shall be that everyone who is bitten when he looks at this pole shall live. So Moshe made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. Notice, the pole was not bronze. You and I have read that, and we thought the pole was bronze. No, the serpent was bronze, and the serpent was put on a pole. Baruch Hashem Yahweh. So that if the serpents had bitten anyone in the camp, when an Israelite looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. I said he lived. What did they look at? The bronze serpent. Not the bronze pole. The pole was the wooden pole. That same wooden branch, which was the staff of Moshe, which was what Adam took with him when he left the Temple Mount, what would later become the Temple Mount, which was originally the Garden of Eden. And it says, and we know from what we studied last week, that Cain was thrown out, Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and they all set up Yahweh's worship on the altar of the Mount of what? Olives. That's where they set up the worship. On the Mount of Olives, facing west. The Mount of Olives is due east of the Temple Mount, still in the land of Eden. So this pole, upon which Moshe Rabbeinu hung a bronze serpent, was the same rod, the ancient branch of the tree of life, that remnant of the tree of life, that Yahweh had mightily used through the ages. The children needed a miracle quickly. So Yahweh told Moshe to get the rod that stood in front of the presence of the people in the tabernacle and fashion a crossbeam and place a bronze serpent on it, so that if the people looked, they would be instantly what? Healed. And it is interesting to note that the Hebrew word, as we talked about last week, for almond is the word shekadem, from the single word shakad, that means to hurry. Okay? To hurry. So the almond branch was the branch from the tree of life, and that is a branch that was handed down from generation to generation. When man, Adam and Chava, were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they went from the Temple Mount down the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, where Yahweh's worship was established, facing the Garden of Eden, but the door that did not allow them to return to the Temple Mount, which would later become the Temple Mount, because Yahweh said to Cain, why are you not obeying me? Why are you bringing a vegetable sacrifice, Bereshit chapter 4, and you're turning your back on me and you're doing your own thing when your brother Abel, Hevel, is bringing the sacrifice on the altar of Adam. Turn to your neighbor and say, altar of Adam. On the altar of Adam that Adam built, facing Yahweh, before Yahweh, at the summit of the Mount of Olives. And so Cain refused to face Yahweh. He refused to sacrifice before Yahweh. And he brought a vegetable offering on top of everything else. And Yahweh rejected his sacrifice. And Yahweh said, you know why I'm rejecting your sacrifice? Because sin lies at the door. What? The door back to the Garden of Eden. We saw Jacob at the Garden of Eden in Genesis 28, when he said, this is the house of El, which would later become the house of El. And we saw Abraham in Genesis 15 pitch his tent on the mountain across from the Temple Mount in the land of Moriah, facing west, but being on the east when he pitched his tent. So we got to go over that. No, let's move ahead. Baruch Hashem. Now, according to our sages, this rod, this tree of life, that was the rod of Moshe, passed from generation to generation. The rod was given to Adam, who successfully gave it down the line to Abel, and who gave it further down the line to Enoch, then to Melchizedek. Who was Melchizedek? Shem. Shem was Melchizedek. Melchizedek had the branch, the almond branch, the tree of life, who passed it down to Abraham, who passed it down to Yitzchak, who passed it down to Yaakov, who passed it down to Yosef, who passed it down to Moshe. How did it get into Moshe's hand? It was buried in the garden of Moshe's father-in-law, Jethro, Yitro. It was in the garden, in his garden, and he was in Egypt with Joseph. And when Yitro went out of Egypt, he took it back to his house and planted it in his garden until Moshe spent 40 years visiting so that he can acquire his daughter as a wife. Amen? And that's where Moshe found the tree of life, or the branch of Yahweh. Baruch Hashem, Yahweh. Then it was passed down, our sages tell us, from Moshe. He used it to put a bronze serpent on the pole. That was the almond branch. That was the almond pole. That was the rod of Moshe. That was the staff of Moshe. And eventually found its way down to Melech David, or to King David. Baruch Hashem, Yahweh. It's also the same staff with which Yaakov crossed the Jordan. Identical also to the one that Judah gave to his daughter-in-law Tamar in Bereshit 32:10. Remember when Judah gave the staff to his daughter-in-law Tamar? Remember? And she said, whoever this man belongs to, whoever the staff belongs to, he's the dude. Remember? That was the same tree of life branch, almond branch, the rod of Moshe, that went to Yehuda before it went to Moshe. So it was passed down from generation to generation. It was also the branch that Aaron performed wonders before Pharaoh. It was also the branch that David killed Goliath with in Shmuel Aleph 17. David took a what? Took a what? A sling stone and made a slingshot. He made a slingshot. But he made it from the rod of Moses, which was the original rod on Mount Moriah in the Garden of Eden. We'll see that in Shmuel Aleph 17:40. For some of you, this is too heavy. I'm going to share with those of you who can receive it. The rest of you, that's okay. That's between you and Yahweh. We're getting heavy here today. The Midrash Yalmidu in Psalm 110 says, when Israel needed another miracle, in the form of a fearless lad named David, the Melech David, the rod was once again used to bring deliverance. He took his staff in his hand. He chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch that he had, and the sling was in his hand. He drew near to the Philistine, he pulled it back, and we know what happened. He said, I come to you in the name of Yahweh, and he killed the Philistine. But we get this slingshot from our imagination. But it doesn't say slingshot, it says staff. You will nowhere find that word slingshot in 1 Samuel 17. You will find the word staff. What staff? The staff of Moshe, which was the staff of Adam that he took from the tree of life. Remember? Yahweh said, from all the trees of the garden you may eat. But when you take from the tree of life, you will what? You will die. So what was the tree of life? And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What was that? The tree of life was the almond tree. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So he would know good from what? Evil. In 1 Chronicles 21, now it gets even more interesting. In 1 Chronicles, in Divrei Hayamim Aleph, chapter 21, we find where David is instructed by the angel of Yahweh. Who is the angel of Yahweh? Who's the Malach Yahweh throughout the Tanakh? Yeshua. Yeshua is the Malach Yahweh throughout the Tanakh. That the Malach Yahweh comes to David in Divrei Hayamim Aleph, chapter 21, to build an altar to Yahweh on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Let's read this. I'm going to read it quickly so you don't have to turn there. Divrei Hayamim Aleph, 21:18. David said to Ornan the Jebusite, grant me the place of this threshing floor, that I may build an altar on it to Yahweh. So you shall grant it to me at the full price, that the plague may be withdrawn from the people. So David gave Ornan 600 shekels of gold. I want you to just write that down. What did David pay for the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite? 600 shekels of gold. The full price, so that the plague may be withdrawn from the people. How did the plague start? What was this plague? How did this plague come about upon Israel? David disobeyed Yahweh and numbered. He took a census among the people of Israel, and he was responsible for the plague that broke out among the people of Israel. Amen? Baruch Hashem Yahweh. And David said to Ornan, grant me this threshing floor, that I may build on it an altar to Yahweh. Why did Yahweh tell David to purchase that threshing floor? Because that was the Garden of Eden, which would become the future home of the Beit HaMikdash and the temple. Remember last week? So David is looking for the Garden of Eden because he wanted to restore paradise in his generation. So he went to this heathen, just like today, the Temple Mount, the former Garden of Eden, had fallen into the hands of the pagans, and he was willing to pay the pagans, the Jebusites, who controlled the Temple Mount in those days, 600 shekels of gold by weight. And so David built there an altar to Yahweh. 1 Chronicles. David built there an altar to Yahweh and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings and called upon Yahweh. And Yahweh answered David from heaven on the altar of burnt offerings. That's Divrei Hayamim Aleph. Divrei Hayamim 21:18, 21:22, 21:25, and 21:26. 21:18, 21:22, 21:25, and 21:26. Amen? How many are up? How many are sleeping? Raise your hand. Baruch Hashem Yahweh. I don't know about you guys. We got to get you excited. I got to do something. The threshing floor, now listen. The threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite was purchased by David for how many shekels of gold? 600. And it became the site for the tabernacle and later the temple that would be built by Melech Shlomo, replacing the tabernacle with a more permanent temple, or the restoration back to the Garden of Eden. We learned last week, don't have time to get into it this week, that the Temple Mount was the Garden of Eden. We talked about the 4 rivers. We talked about the Gihon rivers, where you find the Gihon springs, and those 4 rivers flowed out of Eden, not into Eden, and flowed into the Euphrates and the Tigris, but it all started on the Temple Mount. You can go to Jerusalem today and still see the Gihon springs, which was formerly the fullness of the Gihon River flowing out of Eden. We don't have time to review that today. Baruch Hashem Yahweh. Now we go to 2 Chronicles 3:1. In 2 Chronicles 3:1, the threshing floor of Onan the Jebusite was purchased by David and became the site for the tabernacle and the temple, as I mentioned earlier. But in 2 Chronicles 3:1 we read this. Shlomo, Solomon, began to build the house of Yahweh in Yerushalayim on Mount Moriah, where Yahweh appeared to his father David, at the place David had prepared on the threshing floor of Onan the Jebusite. This is highly significant in that gold, listen, was used to purchase the Temple Mount, because gold represents deity in the Bible. Gold represents deity. The divine, or the divine presence, manifested by the Shekhinah, that would dwell in the Holy of Holies on the Temple Mount. And so it was gold, symbolic of this is where the Holy of Holies would be built, and this is where the Garden of Eden was originally. And we read in Genesis how the Garden of Eden was a land of gold, silver, and onyx, and all kind of precious stones. Remember that? I said, remember that?
Yeah.
I said, remember that?
Yeah.
You said, I remember that. Toe. However, this was not the only place Melech David bought with money for Yahweh's purposes. Remember I told you that the land of Eden extended from the Garden of Eden, which later became the Temple Mount, where the temple was built, Shlomo's temple and then later Herod's temple. I mean Zerubbabel and Ezra Nehemiah's temple, later refurbished by Herod before the coming of Yeshua. And that it extended out 2,000 square feet across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives. And remember I told you, and you'll see this as we go to our diagram. By the way, Bert, I need one of each, please. Can you give me one of those? Please take it from somebody and give one to me. Take it from someone who's walking in love. Thank you, sister. Thank you. Okay. We had 2 sisters walking in love. This is not the only altar that David purchased. He purchased 2 altars. Turn to your neighbor and say 2 altars.
2 altars.
One was the place where Adam and Eve walked with Yahweh in the cool of the day, which was the Temple Mount, which was later the Temple Mount, but originally was the Garden of Eden. They got kicked out of there, across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, and it was at the Mount of Olives where Adam set up the altar that would be the center of worship of Yahweh in the land of Nod, in the land of Eden. Hello. And I'm going to prove all this to you, so just relax. Some of you look like you are puzzled. And that's because you weren't here last week. And I am a puzzle solver. That's my profession. I solve biblical puzzles.
Hallelujah.
That's me. That's me. If I was on Batman in the old days, they'd call me the Riddler. Yahweh. Now we go to the second altar that was purchased by Melech David. Go with me to 2 Shmuel 24. I'm going to prove this to you through the word of Yahweh. 2 Shmuel 24. 2 Samuel 24. Shmuel Beit 24. And let's pick it up in verse number 18. Quickly. And God came that day to David, the king, and said to him, go raise up an altar to Yahweh on the threshing floor of Aravna, the Jebusite. Now, before he purchased the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite, this dude ain't Ornan, this dude is Aravna.